Joseph Haydn is famous for injecting humor into his compositions, and the walkout staged by the musicians at the end of the Farewell Symphony is one of the best-known examples. But there's mischief elsewhere in this symphony, and in the first movement. Did Haydn tell a brick joke? Hello, musicians. Welcome to another episode of Explore Great Music with Ted. Today, we'll be doing a deep dive into the first movement of Haydn's Symphony No. 45, the Farewell Symphony. And let me warn you to watch until the very end, because you don't want to miss what's coming. So with that, let's explore the score. At first approach, this looks like it is a typical sonata form, but we shall see quickly that typical won't apply. Let's begin our discussion by examining the form in key areas. It has an exposition, development, and recapitulation. The key of this movement is F sharp minor, a unique choice among all of Haydn's 107 symphonies. Indeed, minor keys are rare, comprising around 10% of the total. This symphony dates from what is termed Haydn's Sturm und Drang period, and a couple of other minor key symphonies from this period include No. 39 in G minor, and No. 44 in E minor. Zeroing in on the exposition here, we see the primary theme P comprises the first 16 measures, a closed section that begins and ends on the tonic. The transition section begins in measure 17, where it starts by repeating the theme P, but after 4 measures begins a modulation towards the relative major. P gives way to some motivic development, where the secondary section is in sight. Everything is going according to the plan. But I spoke too soon. At measure 38, we have not one, but 2 surprises. First, the key of the secondary theme is not A major, but A minor. If you're keeping score at home, that's the parallel minor of the relative major of F sharp minor. Second, the theme is not a new melody, rather it is a restatement of the primary theme P. This is an example of a so-called monothematic movement, a technique Haydn employs to great effect in some of the later symphonies. As in the transition section, the theme is followed by motivic development that here leads to a full stop on a deceptive cadence in C sharp minor? I certainly wasn't expecting to end up here. A 17-measure closing section K in the minor dominant. At this point, we should wisely take the first ending back to the beginning and take a closer look at what we've heard so far. Theme P is composed of 4 4-measure phrases, A prime, A, and B. The harmonic progressions of these phrases are minor 1 to 2 diminished sixths, 5/6/5 to minor 1, minor 1/6 to minor 4, flat 2/6, the Neapolitan, 2/5 to 1. Now, here are 3 motifs to keep track of. First, the descending quarter notes in the first violins that I've marked as motif X. Second, the syncopated chordal accompaniment in the second violins marked Y. And third, the insistent eighth notes in the low strings marked Z. As already noted, the transition section begins by repeating the first phrase of P, but with phrase A', things begin to loosen up as the modulation towards the relative major begins. Motif Y drops out, and motif Z drops the initial eighth note. Let's call that motif Z'. This facilitates the emergence of a new motif T at measure 39. This is traded between the high and low strings and gives way to a scale-wise ascent that culminates in the arrival of the secondary section at measure 38. The first phrase exactly repeats phrase A of the theme P, but it is not followed by A', rather by a two-measure extension of the last two measures. This gives way to a modulation away from A minor, where the first violins ascend using Z', reaching motif T, which is immediately passed to the low strings as the violins play a descending series of 9/8 suspension. For the closing section, a new melody K is composed of four phrases: A, 4 measures; B, 5 measures; C, 4 measures; and D, 4 measures. 4 measures of pedal comprise phrase C, and phrase D draws on motif X in the legato style of motif U to effect a harmonic transition back to the primary section in the first ending, or towards the development section in the second ending. The development section consists of a complete restatement of the primary theme P in A major. Section 2 follows immediately afterward and consists of 17 measures that modulate away from A major as motif Z rises scale-wise in the first violins, while the low strings move in contrary motion on a figure derived from motif X. B minor is reached in measure 96, at which point the low strings settle on a pedal as the first violins descend in the melodic minor until reaching a German augmented 6 chord that gives way to section 3. These 6 measures are simply a restatement of the closing theme K, followed by a full stop on the dominant of B minor. Haydn's listeners almost certainly would have expected a false recapitulation in B minor that would eventually lead to a proper recapitulation in F# minor. Instead, Haydn delivers an interruption by a completely new theme in D major, almost as if Haydn has picked up pages from a different symphony and dropped them in here. At this point, many of you may remember that Haydn did precisely this in the development section of the first movement of Symphony No. 60, Il Distratto, where the orchestra unexpectedly swerves into the beginning of this symphony before collecting itself and veering back to the symphony at hand. Returning to this score, let's designate this new theme as M, and it consists of two two-measure phrases A and one 4-measure phrase B. M then repeats an octave lower, only this time it ends on a half cadence, and a new motif V replaces the last 2 measures of the B phrase. At measure 124, let's call this N, the V motif is traded back and forth between the high and low strings until the B phrase arrives at a full cadence in D major. Now it seems like we're about to hear another repetition of theme M at measure 132, but a stepwise ascending sequence tapers off, ending on a 7 diminished 6 of F#. Finally, we reach the recapitulation beginning in measure 142, where we can expect some motivic development in the transition that will lead to a secondary section in F sharp minor, if this were Mozart, or F sharp major, if this were Haydn. Wait, this is Haydn! The transition commences after 6 measures where the low strings descend chromatically using the Z motif, and the first violins play tortuous series of sforzandos on motif X. At measure 158, we reach a pedal on the dominant, but as the dynamics drop to pianissimo at measure 163, the harmony morphs into a dominant of minor 4, culminating in the arrival of the secondary section in B minor. At measure 183, Haydn delays the lead up to the closing section by perseverating on alternations between the Neapolitan and 1/6. Of course, this recalls the use of the Neapolitan in the last phrase of the primary theme P, all the way back at the beginning. Before we close, I want to comment on Haydn's employment of humor, which amounts to inside jokes for the musicians and listeners in the know. Perhaps you've attended a gathering where a possibly slightly tipsy fellow has been regaling a series of jokes, where among them was a brick joke. The essence of the brick joke is that a long story is told where there is a hanging thread at the end, a brick tossed in the air, and the punchline falls completely flat to the perplexity of the listeners. After several more stories and jokes are told, of which the last one, on a completely unrelated topic, ends with something to be retrieved, and the audience is asked what that is. Well, naturally, the audience guesses an object relevant to the story at hand, but the correct answer is the hanging thread from before, the brick. I contend that Haydn has told us a brick joke here. Remember that we were expecting a contrasting second theme in the exposition? Well, that contrasting theme, the brick, is the new melody M that shows up in the interruption between the development and the recapitulation. And stay with me here, because I think Haydn actually included 2 more. Remember that the transition section in the exposition led to A minor, not A major? Well, the A major version of the theme, the brick, arrives at the beginning of the development section. Similarly, recall the abrupt stop in the development section on the dominant of B minor? Their listeners could have reasonably expected a false recapitulation, but instead, Haydn delivers it as the secondary theme of the recapitulation in B minor. Yet another brick. Well, there you have it, friends. This concludes our deep dive into the score of the first movement of Haydn's Farewell Symphony, bricks and all. Be sure to continue to the next video where we will explore the score of the second movement. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye for now. The excerpts used in this video were performed by Il Giardino Armonico under the direction of Giovanni Antonini as part of the Haydn 2032 project. Use the links in the description to see the complete performances.